Okay, let's have a chat about the police force. We know from our study of crime and punishment throughout the ages, we've gone back hundreds of years, way back to the Middle Ages. There was never any police force. The Romans never had a police force. There was no police force in the Middle Ages. There was no police force in the early modern period. The big breakthrough, of course, comes in 1829 when Sir Robert Peel, the Home Secretary, creates Britain's first police force, the Metropolitan Police. If there's a question on this topic, we need to know what came before 1829 and how the police developed after 1829. Okay, so what was the situation like before Peel's intervention? There were people whose job it was to make sure the streets were relatively safe. And these people had various different responsibilities. You had in the big cities and towns of England, you had people called watchmen, and these were not particularly effective. They tended to be elderly people, they tended to be part-time employees, they tended to be temporary employees, and to be honest, they weren't very good. London, Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, the big cities of England were growing at a rapid pace during the 19th century, and this form of policing, if you like, was no longer sufficient for such large growing urban areas. In villages and towns, in rural areas, you had parish constables, again, weren't really up to the job of policing large areas. If there was a riot, a demonstration, a protest, then the government would have no recourse but to send in the army. There was no police force to make sure the demonstration passed peaceably. One development that had happened in the 18th century was the development of the Bow Street Runners, set up of course by the two brothers, John and Henry Fielding. They operated within a small area in the centre of London, yet they did not patrol the streets. They tried to apprehend criminals, but they did not have a beat as such. So they had made a first step towards the establishment of a police force, but it wasn't really there in an organised way yet. Okay, how does Peel change this situation? Well, of course, there had always been a lot of resistance to the whole idea of a police force. Why, you might ask? We're so used to them now, we take them for granted. Before their establishment, people thought that they would never work, they would never be successful. And the big stumbling block to the establishment of a police force was, who the hell's going to pay for this? People weren't used to paying tax, they certainly didn't want to fund it out of their own pocket, so the whole notion of a police force always fell down as who's going to pay for the damn thing. Okay, other concerns about a police force was that the police would somehow interfere in people's privacy, pry into their secret lives, if you like. So there was a lot of public resistance to the whole idea of a police force. How does Peel manage to overcome this? In the time that Peel is in office, in the 1820s, there had been a long series of wars against the French, and to pay for the wars against the French, people had been used to paying some money in taxes to pay for the army. So therefore they had got used to the idea of paying tax, therefore perhaps they could be persuaded that they should pay tax to pay for a police force. Secondly, the French Revolution had happened in 1789, and this, as we know, terrified the governing peoples of England, the parliamentarians, the aristocracy. They suddenly felt very fearful of their property and their land, so therefore the idea of a police force, which might in some way protect their property, suddenly began to have an appeal. Okay, so Peel eventually manages to persuade Parliament to pass a law that will bring the police force into effect in 1829, the Metropolitan Police, policing just around London. To begin with, there was a lot of hostility to Peel's new force on the streets. Peel had deliberately tried to make the police as unlike the army as possible because he knew that people would resent the appearance of uniformed people on the street, so he made sure that the uniform they had didn't look like an army uniform. Despite this fact, many people, particularly those people in poor, rough areas, resented Peel's police force, and they treated them with suspicion, and they gave them derogatory names, the Peelers, the Lobsters, Blue Devils, you know this stuff. They weren't welcoming of the police at all. And to be honest, when the police were set up, lots of the men who were enrolled into the police force weren't up to the job. They weren't very professional, they were often drunk, they weren't very efficient, and so there was a lot of hostility to the police in the beginning, in the 1820s and 30s. However, as the century wore on, Peel's police force, the reputation of Peel's police force grew. the people in the poor areas begin to see the police as not necessarily their enemy, but someone who will help protect their homes and their livelihoods. And the police establish a more professional routine. In 1842, the first detective bureau is set up to try and investigate serious offences. In 1901, the first fingerprint bureau is set up, again another step forward in technology. We can't overstate the role of Peel in this. Without Peel, who's a brilliant politician, very able, very charismatic, very persuasive, without Peel to persuade people that the police would work, maybe the police force would have been established much later. So he's one of our key individuals. You must know about his role in persuading people that the police would be a workable solution to the crime in London, which of course by the middle of the 19th century is now the world's biggest city, and it needs a professional police force. Peel's role is absolutely crucial in all of this. Let's have a reminder. Before 1829, amateurish form of policing, if you like. There were watchmen in big cities who were totally incapable of keeping the peace in these big new urban areas. Parish constables in small towns and villages. The army were called out if there was a riot or a demonstration. Bow Street Runners, established in 1749, a step towards the first police force. After 1829, Peel manages, brilliant politician, he's the Home Secretary, not Prime Minister yet. He persuades Parliament to establish Britain's first police force. They're not meant to be an army, and he deliberately goes out of his way to stress to all of his officers, you know, work with the public. You're not there to bully them or intimidate them, work with them, and they overcome public hostility. To begin with, they're seen as drunks and incompetents. Second half of the 19th century, their reputation improves. 1842, first detective department set up. 1901, fingerprint bureau set up as well. So that's the role of the police.